Reconstruction. Today we are going to talk about primary and secondary sources. I know you learned about these in 6th grade, but I thought it was important to give you another overview and a refresher about what are primary and secondary sources. So today I'm going to give you the definitions, I'm going to give you some examples, and then I'm going to ask you some questions at the end where you have to decide if it's a primary or secondary source. So primary and secondary sources are very important when studying history. They are two very different entities. However, they both are important to us. So we are going to figure out who we should listen to and who we should trust when we're looking for sources. So what is a primary source? It's an immediate, first-hand account of a topic from people who had a direct connection with an event or time period, or witnesses to an event or time period. So it's people who saw it happen, lived through it. So for example, if you want to learn about World War II, maybe you'll ask your great-grandpa or your grandpa about what it was like to live through World War II. Maybe you want to know a little bit more about 9/11, and you want to ask your parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles, what was it like to live during 9/11? Now, what is a secondary source? This is the opposite of primary. It's a source of information that's created later by someone who did not experience firsthand or participate in the events. These sources are writing about events that happened years, decades, or even hundreds of years ago. So this is looking back in history and discussing history. So no one alive now could be a primary source for the Civil War or for when the Reconstruction Amendments were ratified. They can just now look back and discuss history as secondary sources. Examples of primary sources. So you can have some examples here of maybe artwork from the time period. Diaries written by people who lived in the time period you're studying. Interviews from people from that time period. Letters written. Documents written. Poems and treaties signed. So for example, if I wanted to look up the Treaty of Versailles and I look it up and I read exactly what was in the treaty, that would be a primary source because it's the text of law or other original documents. Maybe I want to pull up newspaper reports from the Great Depression. Those are primary sources because they were written during an event from people who lived in the event. I could look up speeches, diaries, letters, and interviews of people who were actually involved and lived through that time period. Also, original research from a specific time period and data from a time period. Now, this is interesting. So photographs, video, or audio that capture an event. So we use photographs, videos from a time period. If it's not a reenactment, it is a primary source. Examples of secondary sources. So like, for example, encyclopedias. You would use an encyclopedia to write a report. Maybe you're doing some research, you're going to use an encyclopedia. Encyclopedias are written by people after the fact about specific events in history. Nonfiction books. Biographies. If you don't know what a biography is, it is a story or a story about a person's life written by somebody else. And usually a biography is written after the person has passed away. Our textbook here at school. All of our textbooks are secondary sources. They do have photographs inside that are primary sources, but the actual text is written by somebody who did not live through the event. Nobody alive right now could write about the Reconstruction time period. Essays, TV, movies. So basically, if you watch a documentary, the documentary itself is a secondary source, but they could include photos and videos that would be considered primary, but the documentary itself would be considered secondary. So not one of these sources is better than the other. Primary sources and secondary sources both serve a purpose. The primary source, you can actually grab quotes and look at actual laws, what the laws specifically say. And secondary sources are helpful for research, trying to figure out what happened during a time period in the past. So now we're going to talk about some examples of primary or secondary. So here's a letter that was written by Joe Bright in 1866. He was a freedman who was renting 40 acres in North Carolina. So ask yourself, is this a primary or a secondary source? Is this from somebody who lived in the time period? Yes, it is primary. It is a letter written by a man who lived during the Reconstruction period. It is a first-hand account. Next example. Is this primary or secondary? This is data on illiteracy rates for African Americans during the Reconstruction years and beyond. So is this a first-hand account, or is this information compiled after the fact? It is secondary. It is interpreting data from the Reconstruction period, and it was compiled after the fact. Is this primary or secondary? This is the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. This is the exact wording that's in the United States Constitution. So is this a primary source or secondary? It is primary. It is a text of a law. It is the part of our original document in the United States Constitution. Primary or secondary? This is an excerpt from our class textbook about Reconstruction and the Freedmen's Bureau and Lincoln's assassination. So is this a first-hand account, or is this somebody who looked back in history and wrote about it? It is secondary. It is a source of information created later by authors who did not live during this time period of Reconstruction. Now it's your turn. So is this primary or secondary? This is literacy tests. It says explanation of literacy tests during Reconstruction. So we have the explanation of the literacy tests, and it is from ncpedia.org. So is this a primary account of somebody who lived during the time period, or is this a secondary account of somebody who is describing a time period from the past? Next question. Is this primary or secondary? This is a teacher's monthly report from 1868. Is this primary or secondary? Is this from a person who lived through a particular time period? Or is this an explanation of something that has happened in the past? So is this primary or secondary? Third question, primary or secondary? This is a letter from July 11th, 1870. In this letter, William wrote to his wife before the Ku Klux Klan lynched him for helping African Americans. Is this primary or secondary? Is this from somebody who lived through a time period that we're studying, or is this secondary, somebody who wrote about the past? Next question, primary or secondary? This is an explanation of Jim Crow laws during the Reconstruction period. Is this from somebody who lived through the time period, or is this a review from a time period in the past? Is this primary or secondary? Primary or secondary? This is a photograph of Homer Plessy. This is the Plessy versus Ferguson, the court case that was created that created the Jim Crow laws to continue the separate but equal. Is this primary or secondary? That is all for today. If you have any questions about primary versus secondary sources, please let us know.